You will hear a phone conversation between an estate agent and a woman wishing to rent accommodation. First, you have some time to look at questions 1 to 10.
Fairfield Rentals, Andrew Williams. How can I help you?
Oh, hello. I'm calling from the UK. My family are moving to Canada early next year, and we're hoping to find somewhere to rent in Fairfield for the first 6 months while we settle in.
Right, I see. Well, let's get your details.
Yes, my name's Jane Ryder.
Okay, Jane. And can I have a phone number? The best number to get you on.
Well, that'd probably be our home number. So, 0044 for the UK, and then it's 208 613 2978.
All right. And an email address, please, so we can send you out all the information and forms.
I think it's best if I give you my husband's email. He's sitting in front of a computer all day, so he can print stuff off and get it back to you sooner than I could. It's richard@visiontech.co.uk. I'll just spell the company name for you. That's VISIONTECH.
Great. And we have a question here about occupation.
Richard's an IT specialist for an advertising company. They're transferring him to their Fairfield branch.
Actually, just your job for now, thanks.
Me? I'm a doctor at the hospital in our town.
Okay, I'll put that down. Now, what kind of accommodation are you looking for? House? Apartment?
An apartment, probably, as long as it has 2 bedrooms. There'll be me, my husband, and our 10-year-old son.
And so with an apartment, you're less likely to get a garden.
That's okay.
But what about a garage? Is that something you'll want the apartment to have?
Yes, that's definitely important.
Okay, just a moment. I'll just make a note of that.
But, before we go on, I should probably say now that what we don't need is any furniture, because we'll be shipping all that over, and I don't really want to pay for storage while we're waiting to buy a house.
Not a problem. I'll make a note of that.
Actually, though, just thinking about the kitchen, what can I expect from a rental property? I mean, what kind of equipment is provided?
Well, the normal thing is that you get a stove. I think that's a cooker in British English.
Okay, good to know. But how about a fridge? We'll be selling ours before we come, so if possible, we'd like the apartment to have one for when we arrive.
I can certainly add that to the form. If there's any other whiteware that you need, like a dishwasher, for example, there are plenty of stores here that'll arrange delivery on the same day as purchase.
Thanks. Hopefully we won't need to buy too many things.
Now, how about location? Have you done any research into the Fairfield area?
Not that much so far.
Well, you mentioned you have a boy. I imagine you'd like to be fairly close to a school.
Good idea. That would help. What's public transport like in Fairfield? Is it easy to get around?
The bus service is pretty comprehensive. There are plenty of local routes, services into the city and out of town.
OK, and for a 2-bedroom apartment, what sort of rent should we expect to pay?
Well, looking at the properties we have at the moment, prices start from around $730 per month and, depending on the area, can go up to $1,200.
That's too much. Something halfway would be better.
So, would your limit be, say, $950?
I'd say so, yes.
Can I ask if you smoke or if you have any pets?
No to both questions. But I do have one more request, please.
Yes?
Well, I've also been offered a job at Victoria General Hospital, and I suspect I'll be working nights occasionally. So what I really need from any apartment is for it to be quiet, so I can catch up on sleep if necessary during the day.
Congratulations on the job offer. I'll add your request to the form. Well, what I'll do is compile a list of suitable properties for you and send them via email. Can I just ask, how did you hear about us? Obviously not from our commercials if you're living in the UK.
Actually, it was a friend of ours. He spent a few months in Fairfield a couple of years ago, and he pointed us in the direction of your website.
Well, it's good to be recommended. So, what I'll do is...
That is the end of section 1. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now look at section 2. Section 2. You will hear a manager talking to new employees at a coffee processing factory. First, you have some time to look at questions 11 to 16. Now listen carefully and answer questions 11 to 16.
Welcome to Coffee Incorporated, where you'll be starting work next week. Today's all about orientation, so first I'm going to talk you through the coffee processing that we do here at the factory. Coffee beans are like a stone inside a fruit, and in what's known as the wet process, the outer covering of skin and fruit is removed before the beans are dried. Wet processing involves the fruit being immersed in water in order to sort which fruit can and can't be used. Any bad fruit will float and can be thrown out at this point. This reduces levels of pollution from dirty waste that some other methods produce, though, admittedly, some people do say the wet process reduces flavor, too. After the fruit has been removed, we are left with the beans, which have to be dried to a water content of about 10% before they can be used to make coffee. We do this by machine. This is the way it's done where there are limits in terms of workspace, as is the case here. An alternative drying method is natural drying, which requires the beans to be spread out on special ground areas or tables in the sun. The air is better able to circulate around the beans in the natural method of drying, but it does increase the number of workers required. After the beans are dry, we go on to a process called polishing. This makes extra sure that the beans are completely clean. Some experts believe polishing damages the taste of the coffee, but that's a matter of opinion. And while polishing isn't actually required, we do it here to avoid the possibility of any remaining skin causing problems during roasting. Once the beans are fully clean, they're sorted by size and weight. This is also carried out by machine. The beans are blown through the air, and the ones that land in bins near the air source are the heaviest and best and will be made into the top quality brands, whereas the ones that fall further away are likely to produce a poorer flavor, though they will still be used for blending and making instant coffee and so on. Beans can also be sorted by color. This is the most difficult and time-consuming task, as it's done by hand and needs workers with expertise and experience. Once the sorting is completed, the beans are roasted and stored ready for distribution.
Before you hear the rest of the talk, you have some time to look at questions 17 to 20. Now listen carefully and answer questions 17 to 20.
In a moment, I'm going to take you on a tour of the building and we'll see where all of those processes take place. First, I'll take you through to reception, where you'll sign in and out each day. This is important for fire regulations. That's located next to the visitor center, where we hold tours for the public. Do pop in one afternoon when it's open. As well as seeing the working part of the factory, we have a treat for you, and that's the tasting room, where you'll get to try some of the products we make, and which we sell a selection of in our staff shop. These are available to staff at a discount. For one day only, you can choose something there for free, as our welcome to you. Ordinarily, we'd finish the tour with lunch in the staff canteen. It's being repainted at the moment, so we'll have some sandwiches here in the training room instead. I'm going to hand you out some protective clothing in a moment. Good to see you're all wearing sensible shoes, which we requested for the tour, so thank you for that. There are some caps in the basket near the door over there. Please collect one, even if you have very short hair. They're essential in all food production areas these days. We won't be handling anything today, though ordinarily you'll be wearing gloves to work with the beans. In a moment, I'm going to hand you out a badge with your name on. This is so we can get to know each other better. And hopefully, you've all remembered pen and paper, as I'll be giving you plenty of information to make a note of.
That is the end of section 2. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now turn to section 3.
Recording 61.
You will hear two students discussing their assignments. First, you have some time to look at questions 21 to 26.
Hi, Mike. How's it going? Actually, I was up last night with an assignment, so yeah, I'm tired, but I guess we'd better sort this presentation out.
Well, we've done enough background reading, but I think we need to organise exactly what we're going to say about biofuels during the presentation, and the order.
I thought we could start by asking our audience what car engines were first designed to run on. Fossil fuels or biofuels?
Nice idea.
Yes, when most people think about cars and fuel, they think about all the carbon dioxide that's produced, but they don't realise that that wasn't always the case.
You're probably right. The earliest car engines ran on fuel made from corn and peanut oil, didn't they?
Yes. The manufacturers used the corn and peanut oil and turned them into a kind of very pure alcohol.
You mean ethanol?
Yes. In fact, most biofuels are still based on ethanol. Actually, I've got some notes here about the process of turning plant matter into ethanol, the chemical reactions and the fermentation stages. And
it's interesting. The other students would appreciate it, but different biofuels use different processes. And if we give a general description, there's a risk we'll get it wrong, and then the tutor might mark us down. I'd rather we focus on the environmental issues.
Fair enough. So, the main plants that are used for biofuel production now are sugarcane, corn...
and canola. Of all of them, canola is probably the least harmful because machines that use it don't produce as much carbon monoxide.
Sugarcane seems to be controversial. It doesn't require as much fertiliser as corn does to grow, but when they burn the sugarcane fields, that releases loads of greenhouse gases.
Yes, but some critics have suggested that the production of corn ethanol uses up more fossil fuel energy than the biofuel energy it eventually produces. For that reason, I'd say it was more harmful to the environment.
I see what you mean. You're probably right. It's interesting how everyone saw the biofuel industry as the answer to our energy problems, but in some ways, biofuels have created new problems.
Well, in the USA, I wouldn't say that farmers are having problems. The biofuel industry, for them, has turned out to be really profitable.
I think, though, that even in the USA, ethanol is still only used as an additive to gasoline or petrol. The problem is that it still has to be transported by trucks or rail because they haven't built any pipelines to move it. Once they do, it'll be cheaper, and the industry might move forward.
That'll have to happen one day. At least the government are in favour of biofuel development.
Yes, but Brazil's probably in the lead as far as biofuels are concerned. They've got to the point where they don't need to import any oil now.
Which is great. And the industry in Brazil employs a huge number of people. But is it sustainable? I mean, as the population grows and there are more vehicles on the roads and there's more machinery, surely they can't depend so much on sugarcane. At some point, there has to be a limit on how much land can be used for sugarcane production. Certainly, if you want to preserve natural habitats and native wildlife.
I think that whatever problems Brazil's facing now, the same will be true for any country. You have to weigh up the pros and cons.
Well, we probably won't see an increase in biofuel use. I mean, they won't replace fossil fuels until we can find ways to produce them cheaply and quickly and with less cost to the environment.
Making sure they require minimal energy to produce.
Exactly. And in a way, that means they have to cost less than fossil fuels, certainly when you're filling up your car.
Yes, and whatever other kind of engines use fossil fuels at the moment.
Now listen and answer questions 27 to 30.
All right, so in the last section of the presentation, what problems are we focusing on?
Well, we've already had a look at different types of pollution in the first section, so we can leave that out. But the biggest issue related to biofuels is that land is now being used to grow biofuel crops, and that's contributing to global hunger.
Indeed. It doesn't seem right we're using corn to run cars when people can't afford to buy it to eat. Yes, let's talk about that. The other thing is that in some countries, the way that biofuel crops are grown and harvested still produces a great deal of pollution, really damaging to the atmosphere.
OK, that's definitely an issue we should look at.
Let's not finish on a negative note, though. Why don't we talk about the potential new sources of biofuel? So rather than corn and sugarcane, what other plants could be used?
Good. Some companies are exploring the possibility of using wood and seeing how that can be used to make ethanol.
Yes, and algae is another possibility. You can grow it in any water and it absorbs pollutants too.
I read that. And grasses, they're another plant that researchers are investigating as a biofuel.
And these kind of plants aren't used as food, which is why...
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers.
Now look at section 4. Section 4. You will hear a lecture about the history of time measurement. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 40. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 40.
Hello. Today, I'm going to be talking about the history of the measurement of time, something we all take for granted now. These days, we're able to measure time extremely accurately, and there's global agreement on what the time is anywhere in the world. But of course, this has not always been the case. So, when and how did it all begin? Well, we can tell that prehistoric people from 30,000 years ago were aware of the changes of the moon as time went by. But 25,000 years passed before humans began to actually track time. There is credible evidence for this from around 5,000 years ago, and they did this by observing not just the movement of the sun, moon, and stars, but by measuring where these were in relation to the Earth, and, in particular, where these were in relation to the horizon. This was known as horizon tracking. For example, they noted the position on the horizon of the sun at sunrise and sunset, and how these positions changed throughout the year. From this, they were able to predict when the longest and the shortest days of the year were. Initially, this measurement was quite inaccurate, and relied on suitable natural markers being on the horizon, such as hilltops, trees, etc. But measurement became more accurate and detailed when certain communities built markers specifically to view how the positions of the sun and moon related to them. One of the best remaining examples of these is Stonehenge in England, which consists of a number of very large stones arranged in a circle. Okay, so let's have a look at the first clocks. It wasn't until around 1400 BC that the first primitive clocks were used to measure length of time. These were water clocks, and time was measured by filling a bucket with water which had a small hole in the bottom of it. As the water dripped out, the water level went down, marking the passage of time. Early civilizations also used the sun to measure time. Sundials were used to cast a shadow from the sun onto a horizontal surface marked with lines indicating the hours of the day. As the sun moved across the sky, the direction of the shadow moved across the dial, and the time could be read. Early time measurement in China and Japan also involved the burning of incense sticks. The longer the stick, the longer it burnt, and so standard lengths were used to measure lengths of time. Sometimes a stick with a different smell was burnt at a certain point in the day, and workers would know when to move on to the next task because of the change in incense. Let's now look at mechanical clocks. The first evidence of these is in the late 13th century in Northern Europe. They were made of iron, rather large and heavy, and the wheels of the clock were driven by a weight, which slowly descended. Initially, mechanical clocks didn't have a clock face and just struck a bell every hour. They were also only accurate to the nearest quarter of an hour, but it didn't matter if the time wasn't quite right, because there was only one clock in each community. However, when people travelled to other communities, they discovered the time there was different. This first became a real problem with the introduction of the railways in the 1840s. Up until then, sundials had been the most accurate way of telling the time, but these were dependent on shadows made by the sun, and this was too inaccurate for producing timetables. This meant that there was a need for a nationally agreed time system, and in 1847, the time at Greenwich in London was taken to be the point on which the national time was based. There was inevitably a lot of resistance to this in the middle decades of the 19th century. People in other places, like Bristol, for example, wanted their own time and didn't want to be dictated to by London. An even bigger problem came a few years later with the need for a globally recognized time system. International shipping at that time used maps on which Greenwich was the main reference point. As zero longitude passed through Greenwich, it was decided at a conference in Washington that all longitude would be calculated east and west from there. So then it made sense to use Greenwich to also measure time for the whole world, starting at the observatory at midnight. People could therefore be confident that when it was 8 a.m. in California, it was 5 p.m. in Paris every day.
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.